Ben Napier built his reputation by restoring broken houses, but quietly, his own life was being tested in ways viewers never saw. To millions of fans, he represented comfort, stability, and the reassuring feeling that things can always be fixed. Yet behind the calm voice and steady hands was a man carrying fear, exhaustion, and responsibility far heavier than any beam of reclaimed wood. This is not the story that played out on Sunday nights. It's the one that unfolded when the cameras weren't rolling, and Ben Napier had to confront how fragile everything really was. Before the fame, before the cameras. Long before Hometown became a familiar presence in American living rooms, Ben Napier lived a life guided by faith and duty rather than television ambitions. He was raised in a deeply religious family, with both of his parents serving as ministers. From an early age, Ben was trained to believe that service was not optional, it was a calling. For years, his path seemed clear. He worked within the Methodist Church, eventually becoming a youth minister, dedicating his time to mentoring young people and maintaining the structure of church life. At the same time, there was another skill quietly shaping his identity. Ben had an instinctive talent for woodworking, one that stood out even when it was only a side passion. He could take discarded, broken, or unimpressive materials and turn them into something functional and beautiful with alarming speed. People noticed. Compliments became frequent. What began as casual craftsmanship slowly revealed itself as something deeper, an ability to see potential where others saw decay. For a long time, Ben lived between two worlds. During the day, he fulfilled his responsibilities as a minister, committed to faith and community. In his remaining hours, he refined his woodworking skills, learning through hands-on experience, working with different businesses, and steadily sharpening his craft. The pace was relentless. He was working full-time while building a second career from scratch, often sacrificing rest and personal time to keep both paths alive. Eventually, the tension became impossible to ignore. Ben realized that trying to honor both callings meant failing himself. He had to choose. Leaving church work was not an easy decision. It meant stepping away from a role his family had prepared him for his entire life. But woodworking had become more than a hobby. It was the only space where he felt fully himself. Around this time, Ben met Erin, the woman who would become both his wife and creative partner. Together, they formed a balance that neither could achieve alone. Ben brought structure, craftsmanship, and physical labor. Erin brought vision, storytelling, and design. What viewers would later see as effortless chemistry was forged through years of uncertainty, financial risk, and hard-earned trust. By the time Hometown entered the picture, Ben Napier was already exhausted, but determined. He had rebuilt his identity once before. He had no idea he would be forced to do it again. When everything changed at once. When Hometown first aired, success arrived faster than Ben Napier had ever experienced. What began as a local renovation project in Laurel quickly transformed into a national phenomenon. Viewers didn't just tune in for design ideas, they came for the feeling Ben and Erin created. The show felt safe, familiar, like returning to a place that never judged you. And Ben, with his calm voice and grounded presence, became the emotional anchor of that experience. But sudden popularity doesn't slow life down. It accelerates it. Within a short span of time, Ben went from working quietly in his shop to becoming a recognizable public figure across the country. Requests poured in. Homeowners wanted him. Cities wanted revitalization. Local authorities began pushing larger projects, hoping his work could attract investors and tourism. What looked like opportunity was, in reality, pressure stacking on top of pressure. Ben wasn't just filming a television show. He was still running a business, overseeing complex renovations, managing crews, and physically doing much of the labor himself. Unlike many television personalities, he never stepped back from the work. He carried heavy materials, tackled demanding builds, and took on schedules that left little room to recover. The show didn't replace his workload, it multiplied it. At the same time, Ben was becoming something he never set out to be, a symbol. Fans projected comfort and certainty onto him, expecting him to always be steady, always capable, always present. But behind the scenes, exhaustion was setting in. His days were long, his responsibilities endless, and rest became something he postponed indefinitely. During this period, Ben's health quietly began to deteriorate. He gained significant weight, something he later acknowledged ran in his family but was worsened by stress, poor diet, and a complete lack of balance. Between filming, woodworking, and family life, there was no space left for himself. His workshop became cluttered. His schedule became chaotic. He pushed through fatigue because stopping didn't feel like an option. What made this phase especially heavy was timing. Ben and Erin were raising their young daughters while navigating fame they never chased. The very show that built their reputation was also consuming their privacy. Ben, already deeply protective by nature, started to feel a growing unease about how exposed his family had become. The wake-up call he never expected. By the middle of the decade, Ben Napier could no longer ignore what his body was trying to tell him. Years of overwork, constant pressure, and neglect had accumulated into something more serious than exhaustion. He later admitted that during this period, his health reached a point that frightened him. Tasks that once felt routine began to feel overwhelming. His energy dropped. His recovery time slowed. And beneath it all was a quiet realization he hadn't prepared for. If nothing changed, he might not be around long enough to watch his daughters grow up. This wasn't a dramatic collapse. There was no single public incident. It was worse than that. It was gradual. Ben kept going, kept working, kept filming, because that's what was expected of him. But inside, he was wrestling with fear. He looked at his children and began to imagine absence, not legacy. That thought stayed with him. Around this time, Ben made a decision that would alter the course of his life. He began to change how he treated his body. Not for television, not for appearance, but for survival. He introduced cardio and weight training into his daily routine, something that felt almost impossible given his schedule. Even more difficult was changing his diet. He openly acknowledged giving up foods he loved, including greasy staples that had become part of his routine. The results were undeniable. Over time, Ben lost 55 pounds. More importantly, he regained stamina, clarity, and a sense of control he hadn't felt in years. But the transformation wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick. It required discipline at a time when he already felt stretched thin. As his health stabilized, another realization surfaced. Fame itself had become a threat. The attention that once felt flattering now felt invasive. Social media, in particular, became something the Napier family actively stepped away from. Ben and Erin made a conscious decision to limit their presence and shield their daughters from public exposure. Faces were blurred, appearances were minimized. The goal was simple: protect the children before they were old enough to decide whether they wanted to be seen. When fame turned into fear. What happened next was not something Ben Napier ever imagined he would have to deal with. It wasn't criticism. It wasn't online rumors. It was real, immediate, and terrifying. A strange man moved into the neighborhood near Ben's home, and from the beginning, something felt wrong. The man was over 50 years old and had recently come from California. What unsettled the community was not just his presence, but his behavior. He dressed in unusual costumes, sometimes resembling a stormtrooper from Star Wars. He wore an ankle bracelet. He lived in a nearly empty house, owning little more than a suitcase. There were no plates, no furniture, no signs of a normal daily life. Yet inside that emptiness, one thing stood out. He kept toys intended specifically for Ben's children. The man began speaking in disturbing ways, telling people he had been sent by God, claiming he was a savior tasked with protecting the women of the town from evil. What crossed the line was when he started speaking about Ben's daughter by name. He said he wanted to save her. For Ben, hearing that from a grown man was not strange. It was horrifying. The situation escalated quickly. The man began lingering near Ben's home. He followed the girls and even walked alongside their nanny when they went to the park. In front of the children, he made aggressive and inappropriate comments to the nanny. This was no longer paranoia. It was a direct threat. Ben did what any father would do. He called for help. Security was brought in, staying near his daughters around the clock. For the first time in his life, Ben Napier admitted he felt completely powerless. He could rebuild houses. He could anchor a television show. But he could not guarantee his children's safety. What made this even more unbearable was timing. Erin was 9 months pregnant during this ordeal, already physically and emotionally strained. Fear filled their household during what should have been a moment of anticipation and joy. Sleep became impossible. Every movement outside the house triggered anxiety. The community didn't stay silent. Multiple complaints were filed. Residents reported the man's behavior toward women and children. Authorities initiated an investigation after receiving a large number of reports. Eventually, the man disappeared from the neighborhood. He was never seen again. Pain, silence, and the cost of keeping going. After the fear subsided and the neighborhood returned to a fragile sense of normalcy, Ben Napier faced another battle, one that had been quietly building for years. What began as minor shoulder discomfort slowly evolved into persistent, debilitating pain. At first, he ignored it. He assumed it was just another consequence of physical labor, something rest would eventually fix. But it didn't fade. It worsened. The pain reached a point where even basic movements became difficult. Lifting, reaching, working in the shop, tasks that defined Ben's identity, started to feel impossible. The reality was unavoidable. His body was breaking down under the weight of years of strain. Doctors confirmed what Ben had feared. A bone spur had formed, and the surrounding cartilage was damaged. Surgery was no longer optional. It was inevitable. For someone whose life revolved around movement and creation, the decision was devastating. Surgery meant stopping. It meant surrendering control. Recovery would take months, not weeks. And pain, real pain, would follow. Ben went through with the operation. Surgeons shaved down the bone spur and trimmed damaged cartilage. The procedure was successful, but recovery was slow and grueling. For months, he struggled with limited mobility, discomfort, and frustration. Physical therapy became a new routine, one that required patience rather than strength. Erin stood beside him through it all, encouraging progress even when it felt invisible. During this period, Ben largely disappeared from the public eye. Fewer interviews, fewer appearances, no grand explanations. To some fans, it felt sudden. To Ben, it was necessary. Healing demanded silence. Protection demanded distance. And yet, he didn't quit. As his strength gradually returned, Ben stepped back into what he knew best: quiet work, meaningful renovations, and homes built for real people rather than spectacle. One of the most personal projects during this time involved his own family. His brother Jesse and sister-in-law Lauren had purchased a house without consulting Ben, confident they could renovate it themselves. Then came the news that changed everything. Lauren was pregnant with their third child. The situation was tense. Renovating for newlyweds is one thing. Renovating for a growing family under pressure is something else entirely. Ben and Erin stepped in, not for television, but because family needed help. What began as a private struggle became part of the story viewers would later see. Proof that Ben never stopped showing up, even when it cost him. Despite the fear, the pain, and the exhaustion, Ben Napier kept working. Not for fame, but for purpose. And slowly he found his way back. What he lost, and what he chose to keep. By the time Ben Napier returned to work in a more visible way, he was no longer the same man audiences first met. The steady hands were still there. The quiet voice remained. But something fundamental had shifted. He had learned, through fear, pain, and near loss, that not everything can be rebuilt once it breaks. Ben continued working on Hometown, but with limits. He no longer chased attention. Talk shows and public interviews became rare. Social media stayed at a distance. His priority narrowed to what mattered most: his health, his wife, and the safety of his daughters. Fame had taught him an uncomfortable truth. Being loved by millions does not protect you from danger, and being visible can sometimes invite it. At home, life became quieter by design. The Napier family chose privacy over relevance, even as the show continued to succeed. Ben still renovated houses, still restored vintage and Victorian properties, still expanded his business by working with people who shared his values. But the pace changed. The ambition shifted from growth at all costs to sustainability. Season after season, viewers noticed his absence from certain moments, fewer appearances, fewer personal revelations. Some wondered if something was wrong. The truth was simpler and heavier. Ben had already paid the price for pushing too hard. He wasn't willing to pay it again. The man who once tried to be everything, a minister, a craftsman, a television host, a public figure, finally allowed himself to be just one thing at a time. And in doing so, he chose survival over spectacle. Ben Napier didn't step back because he failed. He stepped back because he learned where the edge was and refused to fall off it. So when you look at Ben Napier today, do you see someone who disappeared or someone who protected what mattered most? If you were in his place, would you choose the spotlight or your family? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more real stories behind the faces you think you know.